Hi everyone, I'm in Denver, Colorado, and it's summertime. No, that's not a joke. It is actually September 9th, 2020. 2 days ago, it was 90 degrees outside. Last night it dropped below freezing and we had a couple of inches of snow fall on the ground here in the Denver metro area. You know what makes this so funny is that when we think of weather, we tend to think of a certain level of predictability. We tune into our weather stations in the morning or at night to find out what the day is going to hold and how we are going to be able to plan on how to dress and what kind of shoes do we need to wear. Are we going to need sunscreen? Are we going to need umbrellas? We like predictability. Predictability brings us security. It brings us confidence. It gives us the chance to make a plan and to be able to stick with those plans. Yes, there are always a couple of unknowns along the way, but we feel good when there's a plan in place that we believe will hold over the course of that time. When we look into the way we do business, we like predictability there as well. People will talk about a risk aversion. And it's the question of how much risk are you willing to take? And once you figure out how much that is, then you put a plan in place. When you look forward to retirement, you have that nest egg to be able to make ends meet when you decide that you're done working in your lifetime. And even when we know that there are things that we can't foresee the future on, we put safety nets in place. It's what insurance is for. When the accidents happen, when we come face to face with the unknown, we have the safety net in place to be able to help us handle what has come our way. But inevitably in life, there are times that we are hit with a situation that there are too many unknowns. There's no way of predicting what's coming around the bend. And thus there's no way to put a safety net in place to give us security and confidence about what the future may hold. When those times come, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to think? How are we supposed to react? Join us today as Brett discusses with us about the unknown, about the things that we have no control over, the things that we can't see coming. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about embracing the unknowns through the haze.
It was a fairly average workday for Joe Ditmar. He worked in the insurance industry. That morning he had to get up kind of early and he hopped on a train in Philadelphia. And the plan was to go ahead and ride that train into New York City, which he did. Before the meeting had occurred, they were getting everything all set up in their meeting room. But then a tragedy occurred. It turns out that a plane had flown into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Joe Ditmar recounted the events and talked about how he saw billows of black and gray smoke coming out from the building and how there was a gaping hole in the side of the building and that the flames were a deeper red than he had ever seen. Well, the reason that Joe had such a great view is because he was in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He was up on the 105th floor of the North Tower. And of course, they watched for a while as the tragedy unfolded over in the South Tower. Well, when they got word that they needed to go ahead and evacuate the building, Joe had a decision to make. Stairs or elevator? Joe decided to go ahead and take the stairs. When he had made it down to the 72nd floor, that's when the second plane now hit the North Tower, the tower that he was in. Of course, now panic is ensuing in the building, and everybody was trying to work their way out of the building. Well, as it turns out that there were people in his very business meeting that had decided to take the elevator that day, and those people did not make it out of the building. Joe was able to find his way down the stairs, out the building, and to get on the train where he went back to Philadelphia, where he stayed with his parents that evening, after calling his wife for what he said felt like the 50th time that day. I'm sure she was beyond worried. The congregation that Joe was with the following day was having kind of a worship service or a prayer service. And when he had called his wife said that she was going to be at that. And so Joe said, well, I'll meet you there. And so Joe, that evening when he arrived, opened the back doors of the auditorium, and every eye turned. Of course, they knew where he had been. And he recounts how his wife jumped over the back pew and ran towards him, and that she was not a person that was so showy with her love, but of course the situation dictated such an appropriate response as this. She jumps over the pew, she runs to him even though it's in the middle of worship, and gave what he said the greatest hug and kiss that a man could ever want. I can only imagine the love that he felt. And Joe goes on to say that he knew at that moment that he was home, and that he had never had a better feeling in his entire life. It's situations like these, and of course many others, that change who we are. I know that you probably remember where you were when 9/11 hit. I remember where I was when 9/11 occurred. It's things like these that cause us that change the fabric of our country. And when we encounter something like this, it is a massive unknown. Who could have ever imagined that something like this would occur? Who would have ever thought that terrorists would be able to accomplish something like this? And yet it did occur. Today in 2020, we're dealing with a pretty significant unknown. Yes, it's different, of course, from a tragic event like 9/11. But, as we have said, there have been many that have died. But when we think about the unknowns and how do we navigate an unknown like this, it's difficult and it's challenging. And as we have said, there's so much of the fabric of our lives that has had to change. When you take a look at the different levels of unknown that can occur, I can see maybe 3 different levels of unknown that we face. The first level of unknown is just simply not knowing the future. And that's just general stuff. As we just talked about, it's snowing here in Denver. Well, it was 90 degrees, 100 degrees a day or two ago, and yet it's in the 30s and snowing. That's an unknown. The weather is an unknown, right? And as much as weathermen may try to capture it, to figure it out, it's an unknown. We deal with things like that. We deal with the weather, we deal with traffic, we deal with just the general unknowns of life. That'd be the first level, the surface level. The second level is when certain events change the future path and make it unknown. And so there can be a variety of events that can occur in life that cause the future to be unknown, uncertain. What's it going to be? It may be that we have a health scare, for example, that causes us to not know what the future is going to hold. It may be that a person is laid off from a job and they don't know what the future is going to hold when it comes to their financial situation, or it comes to even where they're going to live. There could be some significant events that cause us to not know the future. But then there's the third level of unknown, the deepest level of unknown. And this is when there's such a major event that is occurring that it impacts our very identity, that there's so many unknowns. It causes us to go all the way down to the deepest parts of ourselves and say, who am I? Where do I belong? What's really important to me? The events that occurred on 9/11 were, in a lot of ways, this third level, where it caused a lot of people to back away from everything else in life and say, what's really important? For Joe, what he realized was so important was his relationship with his wife. For us in 2020, as we're going through the coronavirus, so much of our lives had to be canceled. We're hearing of the fear and the anxiety that's coming from the coronavirus. And a lot of people are scared. So many events were canceled. Jobs were put on hold or worked from home, and of course some continue to have to go to work. School is canceled or goes to online. All of the extracurricular activities were canceled. So much of the busyness that we have surrounded ourselves with was canceled. And it left the core of who we were. We were left with time on our hands to where we had to decide, who am I really? And what's truly important to me? So this level of unknown that we're dealing with can be quite a challenge as we're trying to navigate just how to handle these unknowns and to ask ourselves the deep questions about who we are and what is truly important to us. In Scripture, there are a lot of people that had to deal with unknown situations. The level 3 unknown, where it had to impact their identity, where they had to really figure out who they were and what was important to them. One of the ones that comes to mind is that of the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people, of course, were in the book of Exodus being enslaved by Pharaoh. They were being oppressed and they were being driven to, of course, build lots of things. And they had been crying out to God, and God talks about how their cries had reached him and he had decided to deliver them, of course, through Moses and Aaron. Well, when they go through the 10 plagues and all of this, these amazing events are unfolding, that's punishing Egypt and causing Pharaoh to eventually and finally allow them to go, they finally are able to go after the death of the firstborn. And as they're going out into the wilderness, this is a major change. If you can imagine trying to be one of the people that was going and witnessing these events and living during these times, there were so many unknowns. Where are we going to go? Who is this guy Moses? I haven't even met him. I've heard of him, right? Or, what are we going to eat and drink? What's going to happen? And of course, you can imagine that there were so many things going through their mind as they were navigating through this huge change in which they had been in Egypt for so long, and yet they're heading towards a wilderness of unknowns. And so when the first bump in the road occurs, when they reached the Red Sea, and they are now faced with this obstacle that in their minds is insurpassable, they begin crying out and showing their true colors. And this is one of the ways that we can be reacting when it comes to these unknowns. If we're not careful, we can end up reacting in the same way that the Hebrew people did. What it says in Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 12 is this. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is it not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." These people are, of course, afraid. They don't know what the future is going to hold, and they're thinking that this is going to be their end. The future is so unknown or so dangerous to them that this is their reaction. Even though God has displayed his power through the 10 plagues, even though it's very clear that God is guiding them, the unknown is scary. And the fact that you have an army coming up is scary. And of course, they feel like they're going to die. Well, the rest of the story, of course, is that Moses parts the Red Sea. The people cross through. As Pharaoh's army comes through the Red Sea, God releases the sea and he destroys Pharaoh's army. And the Hebrew people are then released. But of course, we know that they're grumbling and they're complaining does not stop there, and that they're regularly afraid for their lives, and they eventually are going to get to the land of Canaan, and they're going to be scared of all of the giant people that live there and say, we can't take it. The unknowns that they had to deal with were, in a lot of ways, unsettling for them and difficult for them to manage. But their reaction to that was one that was negative. They did not show faith in God. If we're not careful, we can allow our faith also to be hampered. See, what the Hebrew people at the end of the day had to decide was, who do they truly believe in? Who's really the guiding force of their lives? And unfortunately, it was not God. As everything has been canceled here in 2020, a lot of us have had to ask some really hard questions about who we really are. Are we really Christians behind the scenes when we don't have worship services to be going to, Bible classes on Wednesdays, and all of the events that we had surrounded ourselves with? It may be that we had attached our Christian identity so much to being here at the building and being in worship services that when those things were canceled or we're doing them from home, now we didn't feel as spiritual. And we had to have a deep examination of ourselves and who we really are and what's really important to us. The second example of people that faced an unknown in Scripture is that of Naomi, and of course Ruth with her. What occurred with Naomi is that her husband died, and her two sons, who had also married two women, one of them being Ruth, the two husbands died too. What this meant for her is that her entire support system was now going to be cut off. The people that would care for her, provide for her, it was going to be a difficult life. And it was going to be one that was going to be very challenging for her to have to navigate through. She would maybe have to resort on just the kindness of others, or perhaps even begging, or some sort of means that a person would not want to have to deal with. She shows an interesting reaction in chapter 1 when she arrives back in Bethlehem. Starting in verse 19, so they both, that's Ruth and Naomi, went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. In this situation, the events that unfolded for Naomi was again that level 3 unknown. The world that she knows is canceled. Her husband is gone, her sons are gone, and having to deal with all of these unknowns is one that is very difficult. And unfortunately, the way that she reacts here is by changing her name to Mara. See, Naomi meant pleasant. Mara meant bitter. And so her reaction in this circumstance was one to where she felt very bitter towards God, that God had been bitter towards her. And her reaction, of course, is one of grieving and of difficulty. Well, the rest of the account is that she is going to guide Ruth and help Ruth to find Boaz, where they're going to fall in love and become married. And then, of course, Naomi is going to be cared for through them. Certainly, the events for Naomi were very difficult to manage. All of these events brought a level 3 of unknown. That it brought it to that deepest level to where she had to figure out who she really was. And of course, this is why she changes her name, because she feels like her entire identity is now changed, and who she needs to rely on is different, and her whole world is turned upside down. And of course, her reaction is not one that is the best in being bitter towards God. Of course, things turn out fine, but the level of unknown was very difficult for her to manage. For us here in the coronavirus, there are a lot of people that could be dealing with bitter feelings. God, why did you allow this to happen? Why would something like this occur? And it may be that even some of you have been impacted very deeply, a loved one that's perhaps even passed away as a result of this pandemic. Or even just the bitterness of losing a job or having so much of our lives that it has become stressful and anxious. But one thing we should learn is not to have this reaction that Naomi did. Because she, of course, is not relying on the fact that God is in control, and is not relying on the fact that He cares for her, even though she's bitter. And it may very well be that, again, that we're dealing with bitter feelings ourselves. And so that may be one reaction. So with the Hebrew people, we saw that they relied more on themselves instead of God. For Naomi, she turned kind of bitter in the midst of these unknowns. But a third group of people that I'd like to look at is the early church. Of course, the early church gets started in Acts 2 when Peter and the apostles began to preach to them and they are baptized and become Christians. Well, from then on, the path becomes fairly difficult for them. It reaches kind of a climax point in chapter 7, where a man by the name of Stephen is preaching to several people, and they do not like what he has to say. Because essentially what's communicated is that they are responsible for killing the Messiah, which they were. And so the result is that they began to take stones and cast them at Stephen, and they killed him. Well, this event was kind of the tipping point. And particularly for a young man that was standing there holding the coats in Saul, who will later become the Apostle Paul. Well, in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, we get an indication of just how bad things had become and what their reaction was. It reads, Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him, that's Stephen, to death. And on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women, he would put them in prison. Therefore, those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. This was a day of terrible and great persecution that occurred on the church. This is, again, going to be a level 3 group of unknowns for the people, for the early church. Because now what they have to do is they have to uproot their entire lives. It said that many were scattering throughout all of the different regions because their very lives are at risk. And so they're running for their lives. But how did they respond? Did you notice the end of verse 4? Even though it says that they were scattered, they went about preaching the word. What kind of level of commitment does it take to have your entire world uprooted? To have friends, maybe even family, that are being put in prison and persecuted for the sake of Jesus. And yet your reaction is, okay, we're going to go. Our world is going to change. But we're going to keep preaching Jesus anyway. What an amazing reaction. And this speaks to the core of who they really were. See, in the midst of their unknowns, they did not abandon their identity. Matter of fact, it strengthened their identity because they realized, even in the midst of persecution, we are going to be Christians and we have the greatest message on earth. And we're going to keep preaching Jesus. What an incredible reaction. Here in 2020, as we're dealing with this pandemic and so much of our world has been uprooted, we have to figure out, do we truly believe that we still have the message of salvation? And if yes, then our commission has not changed. We still have people to reach. We might just have to do it differently. We're being scattered among maybe our own cities and not being able to come into worship service for various reasons. And it may be in the future. We don't know even what the future is going to hold. But it doesn't change the fact of who we are and what we're supposed to do. The last person I want to take a look at who dealt with unknowns is Paul. Of course, Paul was the one that was persecuting the church here in our last example. And yet, once Paul became a Christian, he became, of course, just an incredibly devout Christian. But that doesn't mean that he was exempt from hardship and difficulties. Matter of fact, in 2 Corinthians 11, 16 through 23, he talks about all of the variety of persecutions and difficulties that he had to deal with, where he was stoned and he was scourged. He was in shipwrecks, and he was under threat from animals and robbers and from his own countrymen, and had to deal with so many difficulties in his life. When you think about how basically from the time he became a Christian, his life was a huge collection of unknowns. Where is he going to go? Where is it going to lead him? How long is he going to be able to stay? So much of his very life was unknown. And yet he was one of the ones that dealt with it in such a fantastic way. We take a look in Philippians chapter 1, 12 through 14, where he's sitting in prison as he is writing this letter, and yet this is his mindset and his perspective. He says, "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else, and that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear." When we think about what Paul was having to deal with here, he says that his circumstances, meaning being imprisoned, have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. What a fantastic mindset. And it's not as if prison was some luxurious, nice place with a warm bed and a TV to watch sports on. This would have been tough living. And yet his mindset is one that's fantastic. Even though he's in the midst of unknowns, how long is he going to be in prison? How long until he meets justice, where God delivers him? There are so many unknowns that he's having to deal with from a day-to-day and even moment-to-moment standpoint, that it would have been very difficult. You have to really know who you are and what you stand for when you're dealing with unknowns like Paul. Well, again, while we're not imprisoned, we're dealing with plenty of difficulties here as we're going through the coronavirus and dealing with so many of the events as we've talked about. And so it makes us ask ourselves who we really are. It makes us have to look deep within ourselves in all of our unknowns and figure out what's really deep inside. When we're talking about this idea of embracing the unknown, how do we do this? How is it that we're supposed to sit here and not know the future and still embrace the unknown? I want to suggest 3 solutions for us. Number 1, in order to embrace the unknown, what we need to do is we need to embrace the one that's in control, which of course is God. God has not stopped being in control of our situation. He's not stopped being in control of our world and being in the center of the universe. God knows what he's doing. And God very well could have some purpose or some direction or meaning to this. And of course, we don't know what that is. And we talked about that some last class. But what we need to do is we need to embrace, we need to grasp, we need to hold on to the one who is in control. We don't know what's going to happen here in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, even in the next moment, even tomorrow. But we do know that we can hold on to God. And that if our relationship with him is one that is strong, we can weather any storm. That's how Paul was able to manage all of his difficulties. is because of the deep relationship that he has with the one who controls all of this. I want to encourage us, if we haven't already, to, in the midst of all of these unknowns, hold God closer. Develop our relationship with him deeper, further. Because one known that we can have is that God loves us and he cares for us, and that he's going to be there no matter what the future holds for us. Number 2, we need to embrace who we are. And really, really who we are. Well, who we are Christians. The unknown events of 2020 have not caused us to no longer be Christians. We still have God's grace. We still have his mercy. We still can approach boldly to the throne of grace in times of need such as this. All of these events did not cause us to stop being Christians. And so what that means is when everything has been canceled, maybe we've taken a look at our lives and realized we hadn't been living lives like a Christian should. Or that we had been attaching so much of our Christian identity to being at the building and worshiping there, that once that was gone, it caused us to ask some tough questions about how dedicated we truly are as Christians. And so I want to encourage us to embrace the identity of being a Christian. What does that mean? It means that from the way that I talk and the way that I act and even the way that I handle situations like this and the unknown, I'm going to do it in a Christian way. I'm going to do it God's way. I'm going to do it the way that he's dictated in Scripture. And so I'm going to live my life as one of faith. And I'm going to trust him. And I'm going to, no matter what difficulties that I have come up, I'm going to keep being a Christian. We need to embrace the one who's in control. We need to embrace who we are, which is that we are Christians. And then lastly, we need to embrace what we can control. In the midst of all of these unknowns, there's so much that is uncertain. But what we do need to do is embrace what is certain, what we can control. We can control who we are personally, as we've talked about. We can control the love and the relationship that we have with our family, with the time that we invest in them. We can control the little things to help people out in the midst of all of this, like making phone calls or just dropping maybe groceries off at somebody who's in need, or doing things that can be helpful and beneficial. There are a lot of things that we can control in the midst of all of this unknown. At some level, we're going to have to just relax. And it's so hard to do when we don't know what to do. We don't know how to act. There's so many unknowns. But it can bring a peace of mind and a peace of heart when we embrace the one who's in control. We embrace our true identity, which is we're Christians. And then just embrace what we can do, what we can control. And let everything else be flexible. And let it be unknown. And that's okay. Hang in there. Eventually this thing is going to settle down. Eventually we'll get back to normal, whatever that normal will look like in the future. The future is unknown, but it's going to be okay. And let's be there for each other. Let's love each other. Let's help each other manage through this. And above all, let's hold God closer to our hearts. Let's lean on him in the midst of all of these unknowns.
Brett, thank you so very much for those thoughts and challenging us in the way that we think about the unknowns in our lives. You know, the things that you discuss, it brings my mind back to our theme statement that we introduced last time. The way that you think about suffering affects how you will respond to suffering. And it really is important that we figure out how to think about the unknowns. One of the things that comes to my mind is when we face those unknowns, it has a tendency to paralyze us. We become so afraid of not having enough detail that we just stop and we don't do anything anymore, which creates the stagnation, which is just as big of a problem as anything that the bitterness and relying on ourselves that you discussed. And in fact, it's when we become afraid that those other problems begin to creep in. Whereas if we can learn to embrace the unknowns, if we can learn how to not be afraid of them, then that will keep us moving in life. That will keep us more hopeful. And I appreciate what you said, that the way we can embrace those unknowns is by embracing the one who is actually in control of all things. Trusting that God is the one who has this. And with God at the helm, everything is going to be okay. One other thing that comes to my mind, you know me, I'm a big hymn fan, I'm a big singing fan, and as we were discussing this topic the other day, the song, I Know Who Holds Tomorrow, just kept coming back to my mind. And for those of you that don't know it, it was written back in 1950 in a time after World Wars, in a time where there's always something that's a little bit unknown. They're looking ahead to the future. But I want you to listen to these lyrics that were written by Ira Stanfill in 1950. I don't know who holds tomorrow. I just live from day to day. I don't borrow from its sunshine, for its skies may turn to gray. I don't worry or the future, for I know what Jesus said. And today I will walk beside him, for he knows what is ahead. I don't know about tomorrow. It may bring me poverty. But the one who feeds the sparrow is the one who stands by me. And the path that be my portion may be through the flame or the flood, but his presence goes before me, and I am covered with his blood. Many things about tomorrow I don't seem to understand, but I know who holds tomorrow, and I know who holds my hand. Brett, as we wrap this up, give us something that our viewers can do at home to help them in processing the unknowns in their lives, and maybe if they're struggling to embrace them, what can they do to maybe come to a better point of embracing those unknowns?
Yeah, this is tough, and one of the things that I've been encouraged to do over the years when I've been faced with situations that just felt overwhelming or they felt like just tough to handle was to go ahead and list out all of my worries, all of my concerns, and everything that's surrounding the situation that I can think of that is impacting me and it's making it hard for me to manage it and process it. And so that's one of the things that I want to encourage us to do, is to go ahead and try to list out all of your worries, all of your concerns, but then to take all of those worries and concerns and to go ahead and categorize them. Put them in a column. You can get a separate sheet of paper, maybe fold it in half or draw a line down the middle, and on the left column put everything that you can't control. We don't know a lot of what's going to happen in the future, so we can put a lot of different things on that column that we're worried about, that we're anxious about. On the right-hand column, put all of the things that you can control. And then take all of this to God in prayer. All of it in the left column, tell Him your worries, your concerns, all of these unknowns that we're trying to shoulder and deal with. Take all of them that's on that left column, but also the ones on the right column that we're trying to shoulder. But then tear the paper in half. Take the left column that you can't control and throw it away or burn it in the fireplace or something like that, and take the right-hand column and just kind of make a plan on what you can do, what you can do with the things that you can control. So we're taking the whole thing in prayer, but we're trying to stop focusing so much on the stuff that we just can't control, because we can just worry ourselves to death on the things that we can't control and just focus on the ones that we can control. So that would be the challenge that I'd like to give to everyone as we try to manage through embracing these unknowns.
And we want to help you out with that. If you will look, there's a link in the notes section of this video, as well as on the Bear Valley Church of Christ website. You can download a study guide to help you follow along with the things that Brett discussed today. And at the bottom of that sheet, we will have a section where you can begin making those columns, and you can list out those things that are unknowns in your life and how you can deal with them. We encourage you to do that, and we thank you for being with us today. We look forward to continuing this study next week and hope that you will join us as we study through the Haze.